Tonight I will be telling 6 stories. This lineup is going to be comprised of all sorts of different kind of horrors. In the pinned comment, I will have the titles, authors, and timestamps available. In my previous video's comment section, someone asked if I could start doing so, and I thought it was a great idea. I would like to remind everyone that I do read almost all of my comments, or I at least try my best to. So if you have any ideas or critiques, I'm likely to see it. A huge thank you to the writers who allowed me to share their stories. They are the ones who make these videos possible, and there are links where you can find more of their work in the description. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. If you enjoy these hour-long videos, please be sure to drop a like rating, as it lets me know that you want more of them. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated, but only if you like the content. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. I grew up in a small rural town. It had a sort of quaint charm to it. The main street was lined with old buildings that had been renovated into shops. My favorite was always the family-run takeaway shop on the corner and the bakery, which had the best apple pies. But there were also more essential structures like a post office, grocery store, gas station, pub, and a central town hall. Past that there was the school, which was small and underfunded, and then rows of houses that gradually faded into farms, and rolling hills, lush with newly sown crops. As a child, I greatly enjoyed roaming the streets. It was naturally a safe town, and the idea that a kid could get snatched wasn't even considered. The cautionary warnings we were told included, stay away from the creepy old man on the corner, and don't go in the tunnels, which essentially gave my friends and I free rein, as long as we were home in time for dinner. And trust me, we were always home for dinner, since being late meant we went to bed without. Now I suppose I should tell you a little bit more about the tunnels. You see, since we lived in a high rainfall area, the storm drains around the town were huge and old. This meant that in the streets, they were your basic graded storm drains, crusted with rust. However, where they led out a little ways out of town, they were basically giant round holes in the side of cement blocks that you could easily climb into. There were stories of other kids going into them, and getting lost in the supposed labyrinth of underground tunnels, never to be seen again. Which is why our parents didn't want us going into them. Sadly, my friends and I were not graced with common sense, or ears that listened to our parents' warnings. Which is why one fine spring day, all 5 of us, Brody, Paul, Brian, Matt, and myself, decided that we were going to be the ones to explore the tunnels. We decided that we would go on Saturday after lunch, fancying ourselves to be professionals. We planned to ride our bikes to a set of drain outlets we'd found out past the school and bring with us flashlights, rope and string, walkie-talkies, water bottles, and snacks. I was the first to arrive. Throwing my bike to the ground, I ran to look into the tunnel, and as I thought glaring into the darkness would somehow make my friends arrive faster. While I waited, a light breeze rippled across the grass, and a cloud blew into the path of the sun. This sent a chill down my spine. I suddenly felt watched, and as I stared into the abyss of the tunnel, I couldn't help but wonder if there was something in there looking back at me. My trance was broken as a hand slapped down hard on my shoulder, startling me enough that I flinched and earned a round of howling laughter from my friends. "Not scared, are you?" Brian taunted, to which I just muttered a flat, "Whatever, loser," in response. Brian was the jerk of the group, always a shit-eating grin plastered on his face, and something witty to say. He certainly kept us on our toes. Meanwhile, his twin Paul was much more reasonable, the level-headed one of the group. He kept us all in line. Matt was the next to arrive, his red hair unmistakable even from a distance, and with his arrival, he brought an excited energy. He was rearing to go onward to another adventure. It had been his idea in the first place to explore the tunnels. The kid was fearless. Following him shortly was Brody, who was, as usual, the last to arrive, sweaty and disheveled. He threw his bike down and began to fervently list off his excuses for being late. Well, we just rolled our eyes and generally ignored what he was actually saying to tell him instead, "Yeah, sure, you were chased by dogs, and hit by a car, and caught in a freak storm." Pissed him off to no end, but we were at least entertained. With everyone present, and once we had all settled, we ran back through our plan of action. It was decided that since Brody was the last to arrive, he would be the one to stand watch outside the entrance, while the rest of us went into the tunnels. The idea was that all 4 of us would go in together, and as we came across forks in the road, Paul and I, as Team 1, would take one direction, leaving Brian and Matt as Team 2 to take the other. To stop ourselves from getting lost, we tied strings to ourselves, and it would also be Brody's job to keep the reels of thread moving freely. From there, we synchronized our watches and radios, turned on our flashlights, and were ready to go. We entered the drainage pipe one at a time, crawling on our hands and knees, positively giddy with excitement. I really don't even remember what we were hoping to find. Anyway, I'm not going to lie. Crawling along with a flashlight in one hand and a walkie-talkie in the other wasn't exactly as easy as we'd anticipated, but none of us complained. The novelty began to wear off as we got to a point where we'd turned a corner and could no longer see daylight shining in. The change in mood was near instantaneous. Our light joking dropped off. Our pace slowed, and everyone got quieter. It was as if the darkness suddenly became truly dark, and it sent a ripple of unease through us. When we reached our first crossroad, there was hesitance to split up. Though none of us said it, we didn't really want to anymore. Hell, I think we barely even wanted to continue at all. It was a gut feeling we should have listened to, but like the foolish kids we were, we pressed onward, splitting into two groups, as planned, so we couldn't get called pussies. Brian and Matt took the right tunnel, while Paul and I took the left. For a little while, we could hear the sound of them shuffling along, and looking back, we could see intermittent flashes of light from their torches, but after some time we were completely alone. "This isn't creepy at all," Paul commented sarcastically as we crawled along. "Oh yeah, walk in the park." I agreed with equal enthusiasm when ahead of me he stopped. "There's a drop-off here," he informed me. "Is it far?" I inquired. "Doesn't look like it. There's a ladder down there, but there's water." He relayed the information as he scanned the area below with his flashlight. "I'm going to climb down and see how deep it is. Hold the light on me," he instructed. "Alright, be careful." I agreed, taking the time to shuffle up so that I could hold the torch on him as he shimmied down the service ladder. As Paul climbed down the ladder carefully, I was able to crawl forward to look into the new area. Ahead I could see that before us was a large compartment with an opening at the other end. There were tide marks up the concrete walls, indicating that the chamber flooded sometimes, and the different levels at which the water had reached. The water that was in there at the current, however, was an expanse of stagnant, inky black liquid. The surface perfectly unnaturally still, with not even so much as a breath of wind to disturb it. I could find myself shining the light directly down into the water, in an attempt to see the bottom, but under the light's focus, I could see that the water was actually a murky brown, and that there wasn't any way I'd be able to see the bottom through it. Distracted by my thoughts, I lost my grip on one of the flashlights, and it fell into the water with a hard splash before going out, and at the same time, caused Paul to lose his grip as he slipped on the last rung, and crashed into the water shortly after the flashlight. There was a moment of panicked shouting and general confusing before I regained enough to shine the remaining light down to where Paul was now standing, drenched and waist deep in water. "Are you stupid? What did you do that for?" He yelled angrily at me as I babbled out a weak excuse of being distracted and clumsy. "Sorry, it just slipped out of my hand. At least we know how deep the water is." I tried. "Whatever. Great. It stinks, you know. Hurry up and get down here," he growled, still annoyed as he pushed his hair back out his face. He wasn't wrong about the smell. The water was clearly rotting or something, and it was cold too, as I discovered when I joined him. We didn't say much else to each other as we made our way through the water towards the other side, awkwardly holding our hands and equipment up out of the foul-smelling liquid as we did. There was something profoundly unsettling about wading through stinky water in the dim of only a single flashlight. More than once I psyched myself out, believing that something had brushed past my legs, and subtly hurried to keep up with Paul. We had almost made it across when Paul stopped, holding his hand up for me to be quiet as I opened my mouth to ask what was wrong. That's when I heard it. A long, low-pitched wail. It wasn't like anything I had ever heard. It was inhuman and echoed through the tunnels to reverberate around the chamber, making it impossible to tell the direction from which it came. "What was that?" I whispered to Paul. "I don't know." He answered quietly. I imagined the look of fear on his face mirrored my own. Neither of us had any idea what it was. "Do you think it's Brian and Matt messing with us?" I asked, trying to rationalize. Yeah, Paul agreed, with a relieved nod. "Let's just get out of this water and see what's on the other side, then we can go back." "Okay, yeah." I agreed easily. I didn't want to say that I actually wanted to turn around on the spot and leave. However, we made it to the other side much more quickly, with adrenaline fueling our progress, and once there wasted no time in climbing out of the putrid water. It was also fortunate for us that when we reached the top of the ladder, the new tunnel was large enough for us to actually walk through instead of crawl. This filled us with renewed courage, and we pressed on for some time more. By then, we had no idea how deep in the tunnels we were, and checking our watches proved pointless, as they had both stopped working after our water crossing. This made me anxious. It felt as though we'd had been traveling for a long time, and I wanted to turn back, so I was relieved when Paul suggested that first. With both of us in agreement, we turned back to follow our stringtails out. However, we didn't get very far before we heard, or at least we thought we heard, the faint sound of screaming. It sounded as though someone were screaming for help, and the sound of their voice was only ever so slightly being carried to us. "Did you hear that?" I questioned, uncertain. "Yeah," Paul answered, now alert and focusing on the direction we thought it had come from. "Should we call through?" I asked, and with a nod, Paul took one of the walkie-talkies to try and call Brian and Matt. 10 seconds passed with no answer, before we heard the shout again, and this time Paul took off running. "That's Brian," he told me briefly, as I scrambled to keep up. He had the flashlight and I found myself following its light, more than the movement of his body. As we drew near, we could hear with more clarity that it was indeed Brian screaming for help, his tone getting more and more desperate with each passing moment, causing Paul to run even faster. I soon found myself struggling to keep up. Paul was always so much faster, and his determination to help his brother was propelling him much more than usual. At first, he was only a little ahead, then slightly farther, and finally, I was running after only the brief glimpses of light ahead of me, before they disappeared altogether. When this happened, I finally stopped. The sound of my own breath and the blood rushing through my ears was nauseating. I couldn't even find the breath to call after him, so I merely stumbled along blindly through the darkness in the general direction he had last been in. To my relief, I managed to catch sight of the glow of lights ahead after only a few moments. It seemed Paul must have stopped running, so I guessed he'd found Brian. I slowed my pace and moved to continue towards the light, but something told me not to. My body suddenly wouldn't move. There was a wet crunching sound resonating through the tunnel back to me, and I realized that Brian had stopped screaming. My heart began to race all over again. What was that sound? Where had Paul gone? I thought to myself. Summoning all the courage I had left, I tiptoed forward silently. A morbid part of me wanted to know what was going on, while the more sensible part of me didn't want to find out. I reached the corner and stopped. All I needed to do was turn and see, but I couldn't. Instead, I stood frozen. I could hear a soft whimpering and the wet crack of bones accompanied by the velvety tearing of flesh that was unmistakable. Steeling myself, I crouched down with my heart in my throat and slowly began to peek around the corner. What I saw next is something that will stay with me forever. The scene was illuminated by flashlights abandoned on the floor and contained within the expanse of cement hallway. The first thing that caught my eye, however, was the mangled remains of a person hanging from the ceiling. It looked as though his own bones had been broken in his arms and legs and used to anchor him in place. His insides were hanging loosely down, dripping, coagulating blood onto the floor with his exposed rib bones. The face was mangled beyond recognition, but I could tell this unfortunately was Matt from the tufts of red hair still visible on what remained of his scalp. On the ground was Paul. Standing over him was something. It was crouched, its knees bent upward beside its face in the same way a human's would if someone was squatting awkwardly. It had 4 arms, long and spindly as they were. It was using 2 to hold Paul down, while the other 2 were digging into his chest, before bringing chunks of flesh to its mouth and chewing in relish. Paul's eyes were rolled back in their sockets lifelessly, and I knew he was gone. But that's when I noticed Brian. He was slumped away just past the creature. He was looking at me and mouthing the words, "Help me," repeatedly. Tears streamed down his face, but one look at him told me there was no way he'd be able to walk, let alone run, on his own. I shook my head at him helplessly, and he wailed in pure terrified desperation, something that regained him the creature's attention, and it turned back to him. He screamed in panic, but the sound was no more than a gargling mess that erupted from his damaged throat. I couldn't watch any longer, and shakily turned back to return the way I'd come. I crawled with agonizing slowness to remain silent through pitch-black darkness, guided only by the rope tethered to my waist for hours and hours. By the time I finally crawled back out, it was dark, and the area was bathed in the red and blue lights of police. For the last part of my journey, It had actually been their voices through blowhorns that had guided me. I was the one that made it out that day. Matt and Paul's bodies were washed out of the tunnels with the next flood. The damage to them was attributed to falling and being tumbled about in the floodwaters, while Brian's body was never recovered. No one believed me when I told them what had happened. I was sent to a shrink for years after. I think that everyone was expecting that someday I'd change my story. But that's the truth of what happened. Brody did believe me, but we lost touch. Or rather, he avoided me. He had heard the screams from outside the tunnel and ran to get help after tying our lifelines to a nearby tree. He briefly and quietly mentioned to me only once that he had seen something moving in the tunnels not too long after we had gone in. He assumed it was us, and though the way its eyes glowed back white in the darkness made him uneasy, he never radioed what he saw through to us, just as he never mentioned this to the cops or anyone but myself. I think he blames himself just as much as I blame myself. Or maybe he's not telling me the whole truth. Either way, it's been years now. I only thought to write this out because I recently returned home to visit my parents. The town was just the same as ever, only that the storm drains are now inaccessible. I saw them installing massive metal grates to stop kids going down them. Apparently another group of kids disappeared in those tunnels a week before I returned. Authorities say they're still hopeful to find them, but I know that they won't. I've been in the custodial business for about 10 years now, and I've recently discovered a truth that a lot of people don't even consider. When I've talked to friends and strangers about anything paranormal, everyone mentions abandoned buildings, churches, battlefields, and murder houses as places of major ghost activity. But if you talk to theater people, especially the actors, they'll do their best to convince you that theaters are some of the most haunted places in the world. Now, I'll be the first to say that I'm not a superstitious person, and people involved with the stage are some of the most superstitious people in the world. God help you if you say Macbeth anywhere in the theater, and if you wish them good luck, instead of break a leg, you get death stares until you correct yourself. But I've been working as a custodian in my town's local community theater for about a year and a half, and I've seen and heard things that I cannot explain. And after the last incident, I don't want to go back to work there. I'm not going to tell you exactly where my town is, or the theater's name, because I really like the owners, but I truly think the shows they put on are great for our community. I don't want this confession here to negatively impact them and force them to close their curtains for good. What I will say is that my town is located in the Rust Belt, and that should be enough. The building the theater is in has a bit of backstory. It was originally built as an assembly plant during the 40s. In the 60s, it was bought and turned into a theater. Well, a performance space, are the exact words the owners told me when they first hired me. In the 70s, it was swept up again in industry, and became an assembly plant again till the mid-80s, where it closed and was abandoned for a long time. The current owners, a gay couple from New York named Paul and Joseph, bought it 5 years ago, and had it up and running as a theater again in 3 years. Paul and Joe are not spring chickens, and luckily for them, their opening year was an astounding success, and they had funds available for hiring a part-time custodian. At the time, I wasn't working. You see, I had been a custodian at a large high school, and let's just say there was a large percentage of the student body that were far worse than mean-spirited. A harmless prank from a group that were known delinquents that should have been expelled a long time ago ended up breaking my left leg in a few places. One lawsuit later, and the delinquents got the justice they deserved, and I had some settlement money to try and recover from the life-changing injury. Sorry, I got off topic. Anyway, I wasn't working at the time when I saw it in the local newspaper that the new theater in town was looking for a part-time janitor. Growing up, I'd always had an appreciation for the theater. I sucked at acting, and I wasn't creative enough to be a designer or anything like that. But in middle and high school, they were always looking for stagehands to help, and I'd always volunteered. Having sat on my butt for a good 10 months, I decided to get my act together and offer my services. Paul and Joe were ecstatic to have me on board, even when I told them I wasn't the fastest at moving due to my bad leg. They didn't mind at all. They told me they were both in their late 60s, so even with a bad leg, I could move faster and clean better than either of them. The pay wasn't much, but I wasn't in it for the money. I was just happy to help out an up-and-coming community venture that gave some much-needed entertainment to my town. They gave me a tour of the building and I could tell instantly I had my work cut out for me. Besides the typical areas a theater has, the box office, the lobby, the bathrooms, the banks of seats, the stage, a lighting booth, backstage, the dressing rooms and the green room, or the actor hangout area, the building was large enough to have a ground level storage space, a ground level workshop for building set pieces and props, and a basement storage area. But I had worked in far worse buildings before, and I felt a sort of pride knowing that I'd soon make this place immaculate, and some people would be impressed at how clean the seats and bathrooms and lobbies were. It would be even cooler if the actors would perform here in the future, commented on how well kept the dressing rooms and green room were. I may be a custodian, but I still have a sense of pride in my workmanship. At the end of the tour, after I confirmed that I would be able to do all the required work necessary, Paul and Joe told me of the history of the place. Besides the basic history I shared with you, they told me the darker side of the place. It turns out that 5 people had died in the building. 2 people had perished in an industrial accident during its time as a factory in the 40s. And 2 were killed in a murder-suicide when it was again a factory in the 70s. The most disturbing, however, was the one death during its time as a performance space in the 60s. A performance artist. Again, I won't give the name as you could pinpoint the theater from it. Decided to do an exhibit called Will You Cut Him Down? The piece was supposed to be a challenge to the then modern American squeamishness about death and suicide. The exhibit was supposed to feature the performance artist after he hanged himself. He had used makeup to make it seem like he had been hanging there for hours, and the challenge was, would anyone try and cut him down? However, a mistake was made, and the artist ended up hanging himself for real. In the hours that followed to opening the exhibit, the people that flowed in and out of the place were gawking at his corpse, noting how realistic it looked. It was only discovered he was actually dead when everyone had gone, and his assistant tried to tell him he could stop his performance. Needless to say, the place was quickly closed after that. I must admit that the story of the performance artist was spooky, but it was no big deal to me. I didn't mind working in a place people had died. I asked them why they brought it all up, and Joe confessed that he and Paul thought the place was haunted. When I asked why they thought that, they simply said they'd felt like they were being watched on some occasions when they were cleaning up after shows, and that the booth, where the murder/suicide had happened, was always cold. No matter how hot it was outside, or even if they put a space heater in there. I laughed, informing them that I didn't believe in ghosts, and even if there somehow were spirits floating around this place, as long as they didn't interfere with my cleaning, they could wail and clank their chains as much as they pleased. So began my time working at the theater. I poured all my energy into making the place shine, and it really showed. The first show of the season started 2 months after I joined, and Paul and Joe passed on to me how the patrons were amazed at how the building had cleaned up. All the time spent mopping, scrubbing, and polishing had really paid off, and my bosses were extremely grateful for all of my hard work. I was given free tickets to every show, and while some of the performances were a little too artsy for my taste, or maybe I'm simply too gotch for their themes, and layers and things, there were a few plays, like The Tavern by George M. Cohan, that I fully enjoyed. The problems began last October, however, after they had finished up a run of The Blith Spirit. After the final performance, the actors, the crew, and everyone else involved in the production decided to meet at our town's fanciest restaurant for a party. They wanted to celebrate the success of the show, and a profitable season so far. I was invited to come along, but someone needed to stay behind and get the theater cleaned up. So I respectfully declined, opting to sweep, mop, and vacuum the theater so it would look nice the day after. There was going to be a crew showing up to dismantle the set early the next morning. Everything was fine at first. I picked up trash and vacuumed the carpeted lobby, and banks of seats with no issue. However, when it was time to clean the booth, things got weird. It was cold as usual in there, but I always blamed it on weird airflow and poor construction. There are tons of wires in the booth, connecting the theater's lights and sound systems to the actual lights and speakers, so one must be very careful when vacuuming not to accidentally unplug something. So I was used to having to turn off and on my vacuum a couple times in that room to rearrange where it was. That night, when I first turned off my vacuum to move it to a different spot in the room, I heard something. It sounded like whispers. I looked around the room in surprise, but the booth is small, and there was obviously no one else in there with me, much less the theater. My eyes fell upon the sound system, and I thought someone must have not closed the software properly. so the whispers must have been coming through the speakers. Having solved the issue, I continued vacuuming, not touching the sound system as I had no idea how to operate it. A minute or so later, I accidentally knocked some papers off the desk housing the computers and leaned over to pick them up. A loud bang, like that of a gunshot, suddenly blasted into my ears, and as I jumped in surprise, I banged the back of my head on the underside of the desk. It hurt really bad, and as I stumbled away from the desk, trying to open my eyes through the pain, I swear I could see some black form standing in the doorway of the booth. Through squinted eyes, it looked like a bloating cloud of blackness just hanging in the room in front of me, an aura of menace emanating from it. When I took a few seconds to compose myself and look back to the doorway, there was nothing there. I later found out on my own that the man who committed the murder in the 70s shot his co-worker for sleeping with his wife before turning the gun on himself. Nothing else happened that night. But it seems that was the dam bursting when it came to spiritual activity. I didn't bother telling anybody about the incident, but when they began happening more and more, I started keeping a log for both myself and my bosses. There were some of the things that Paul and Joe had felt before, like someone was watching me throughout my cleaning routine across the building, some strange movements of shadows, lights flickering on and off, but there were a few scarier incidents. One time, soon after the first incident, I was cleaning up sawdust in the workshop, as it was a major fire hazard. As I was sweeping all the sawdust into a big pile near the center of the room, I was backing up towards a large table saw Joe had recently bought. As my back just touched the end of it, it suddenly sprang to life with a loud whirring sound. I recoiled from the table instantly, turning around to see who had turned it on. No one was there. It was suddenly silent. The saw blade wasn't moving, and the thing wasn't even plugged in. Another event that comes to mind happened in March. The play they were doing at the time involved an old man in a wheelchair. As I was cleaning the stage after a dress rehearsal, with only the ghost light being on as a light source, it's not what you think. Look it up. As I finished sweeping up the last of the dust into my dustbin, a creaking noise reverberated throughout the stage. I slowly turned my head and glanced back to see the wheelchair, with no one in it or pushing it, slowly wheel its way into the very edge of light cast by the ghost light. I stared at the thing for a full moment, not daring to breathe or blink. I was waiting for something, anything, to happen, and all the muscles in my body were tensed up, ready for explosive movement. It just sat there, half hidden in shadows, like it was waiting for me to make a move. I finally reached the conclusion that maybe the wheels were a little bit loose, and for some reason, it had just rolled off its place on the side of the stage by sheer coincidence. I relaxed, set my broom and dustbin down, and slowly walked over to the wheelchair to push it back into its place. I leaned down and grabbed the wheelchair by its armrests, ready to push the thing straight back up to its holding spot. As my head was closer to the darkness, however, I saw something that stopped me instantly and made my blood run cold as ice. On the back handles of the wheelchair, just out of the illumination of the ghost light, were two black hands, each one gripping the handles tightly. They were covered with scars, burns, and cuts that had no blood flowing from them, and whatever arms they were attached to disappeared into the darkness behind them. I immediately turned and bolted from the building, stopping only to lock the front door behind me, partially to stop burglars from getting in, and partially to stop what I'd just seen from following me out. Yet everything else pales in comparison to what happened last week. It's the worst by far, and it's making me wonder if I have the mental fortitude to keep working at the theater. Joe and Paul are now good friends of mine, and I've truly enjoyed my time working for them and helping the theater thrive. But after last week, I'm honestly afraid my life would be in danger if I entered that place even one more time. Last week I was cleaning the dressing rooms, getting them prepared for another group of actors to come and use them. It must have been around 10 p.m., and I was alone as usual. I was wiping down the mirrors and makeup desks we have in the dressing rooms. There's a loud clock in both male and female dressing rooms, whose ticking is almost so loud you could hear it in the hallways outside. So I was wiping down a desk, lost in thought about something. Maybe it was about a show I watch. I can't remember. What I do remember, however, is suddenly realizing that I can no longer hear the loud ticking of the clock. This was very strange to me, but clocks do stop, so I turn around to look at it to confirm it stopped. It had stopped, but that wasn't what made my eyes wide and the hair stand on the back of my neck. It was the noose hanging mere inches from my face that caused my heart to start pounding like crazy. Not only was the rope close to my face, but the noose was hung low enough to slip over my head and onto my neck perfectly. As I stared at the knotted contraption of death in confusion and terror, another sound came to my ears, the creak of a slightly swinging rope. Looking into one of the far mirrors, a chill ran down my spine as I could see a second rope dangling down from the blackness of the ceiling behind me. But this rope was pulled completely taut, like something was hanging from it, and that's when I saw it. In the mirror, I could see parts of a face peering out from behind me, watching me watch it in the mirror. Only the top left side of the head was visible, and what I could see made me shake in abject horror. Long, stringy gray hair fell off to the side. The skin of its forehead was pale from lack of blood. Its one visible eye socket was deeply sunken in and dark, but the eye itself was extremely bloodshot, almost completely red, with a small trail of blood following the single droplet that fell from its eye. With each creak of the rope, it would swing into view, and then disappear behind my head again. My teeth were chattering by now, and my knees quivering. It was everything I could do to keep myself standing, afraid that if I fell, the noose in front of me would be there to catch my neck and lead me to eternity. But my breaking point was the voice that suddenly invaded my ears, audible even over the seemingly deafening croak of the hangman's noose. In a voice no louder than a whisper, strained through vocal cords crushed inside a long dead throat, I heard, "Will they cut you down?" I screamed, smacking away the dreaded rope in front of me violently, and running as fast as I could to get out of the building, not even caring to lock the front door behind me. So here I am, telling you all about this. I really don't know what to do. Working for Paul and Joe has been great, and it wouldn't be fair to anyone else they hired to have to deal with whomever, or whatever, is inhabiting that place. I met Joe and Paul outside the front doors of the theater yesterday to talk in more detail about it. I thought it would be fine since the sun was shining strongly, but after a few moments of conversation, I peered through the glass front doors a quick moment while Paul was talking to me. Past the lobby, through the open doors that led to a darkened theater, next to the lonely ghost light on the stage, providing the only source of light, was a long, rotting coil of rope descending from the blackness of the rafters, a noose tied tightly at the end of it. I think I need a different job. First of all, this is true, and not just a random story. I'm genuinely scared and I don't know what to do. I'm going to try and make this short because I just want to get it out there, since I'm too scared to go back to my house tonight. So I'm currently renting a place on Airbnb. So a little backstory. I moved into this new house, and right across the street from my house is an abandoned manor. It's cliché, I know, but that's honestly what drew me to getting that house, since I've always been intrigued by abandoned places, especially ones with eerie stories. For example, this manor was passed down from within the family for years, until the last remaining family members who lived there mysteriously all disappeared at the same time in the 1900s, and it's just been abandoned ever since then. I thought that was pretty neat, at first. Things were fine, and I was really enjoying my new place, and then after a while, I was really curious about the abandoned manor. Something just made me feel like checking it out, so I managed to get inside, and within a second, the vibe just felt wrong. Can't put my finger on it, but something was off. I felt like I was being watched, so I ran back across the street to my house, while my heart was racing for no reason. I've never really believed in supernatural stuff, so that was strange for me, but I think that's when things started taking a turn for me. Whenever I would walk home late at night, I would feel like someone was still watching me from the manor across the street. Maybe I'm just paranoid now. Soon after that, I would always hear sounds within my house late at night, while in my bedroom, specifically in the kitchen and living room, but I never really thought too much about it since I'd always hear these sounds right when I was on the brink of sleep. You know when you're just about to fall asleep at any second, and you hear stuff in the background, but it almost feels like it's part of your dream? Well, it was always like that, so I can never say for sure if I actually heard something, or if it was in my dream. But why would I dream of dishes being moved, or someone walking around my home? So now fast forward to last night. I was sleeping in the living room since my bedroom can get quite hot during the summer. So I get my blankets and slept on the floor, which is something I've always loved to do even as a kid. So I got everything ready and turned off the TV, and the lights in the house. When I finally turned off the light in the living room, I got a very unsettling feeling. What was my solution? To quickly hide under my blankets and watch funny videos until the feeling went away? Yeah. I'm aware that it's pathetic. I instantly felt safe under the blankets, so I put my headphones in my ears. But I didn't plug it into my phone yet because I usually do that once I find something to watch. So I completely forgot to plug them in because I started scrolling through Instagram looking at funny memes, until I heard the voice in the corner of the living room and I froze. I honestly couldn't move or do anything. I was too scared to make any movements. I heard something say, "There's one thing you don't seem to understand," and then another voice overlapping it, saying the same sentence, but I couldn't catch the other words because the voices were overlapping each other. It would start with 1, then 2, and 3, and so on until I couldn't make sense of it anymore. The whole time while this is happening, my body is still in shock. I didn't know how to react. I can't even remember exactly what was going through my mind, but then suddenly, all the voices stopped at once. At that moment, I started gathering myself together and remember thinking, what the hell? I also wanted to kick myself for not recording it, just for my own sanity. A few hours go by and I'm still stuck in the same position. You guys, my body was so uncomfortable that I just wanted to move my leg or something, but was still too scared to do that. Right when I'm about to build courage to do it, the voices start up again, with the same build up from one voice to 2 voices at the same time and so on. There's one thing you don't seem to understand. I also was able to catch another thing it said, and it was, in this life and the next. Wish I was able to hear more, but it was so hard to understand with so many voices at once. This time I wasn't going to mess up. I made sure to record it. Very slowly, I moved my fingers to the closest app I could record on, and it was Snapchat. So I started recording a video, and once it played back, I'd be able to hear if the voices were actually there or if I was going crazy. Now once the video finishes recording, I forgot it automatically plays back, which is fine because I have my headphones in. Except I forgot to plug my headphones in, because I never ended up watching a movie, and now this video plays out loud. My heart stopped because whatever is in the corner of my living room now knows I just recorded it. The moment it played back, I quickly plugged the headphones in, and all the voices stopped at once. All I could think in my head was, they know. They know. But at least I still have a recording, and can now confirm that I'm not crazy. But I think that just made it worse, because now I know that something really is there. Now another hour goes by and I'm mortified. By the way, I still want to move my leg. It's been hours at this point. And it's gotten very hot under the blankets. Remember, it's the middle of summer, and I'm sweating. But I'll be damned if I pop my head out from under the blankets, because I don't want to see what's out there. Things start getting calm again, and I'm going to watch something funny to just make it through to the morning. But before I find anything, all the voices start up again. And instead of building up, they all go at once and they're yelling, right next to my ear. Something was on the other side of the blankets. Not even going to lie to you guys. I started crying silently. Eventually I fell asleep, and got up and out of there as soon as possible. Now I don't know what to do, or what that could have been. I'll be staying at an Airbnb for tonight, but I'll have to go back tomorrow. I work in a fairly large office in the downtown part of New York. I've been there for a long time, and I can say that in all my years of working there, I had never, not once seen anything out of the ordinary. Just a run-of-the-mill office, you know? Well, there was really only one part of the office that was different from the rest. We have a basement. That's just referred to as floor 0. It's been boarded off since the 70s, when one of the old pipes down there burst and poured toxic gas into the room, and killed everybody in there. It was flushed out, but the company decided to board it up, before they put several documents in there. Just old accounts that we probably won't need, but might need in the future. The whole thought of floor 0 just creeped me out. To get there you have to go behind a locked door behind a supply closet, and there are no lights so you have to use a torch, and it's really big. So there could be anything in there hiding to get you. I tried my absolute best to avoid going anywhere near it. My avoiding had been going very well, until one day my manager asked me if I could go down to get some old documents. I had to do it because I was late, so I missed out on the opportunity to not go. I was late to work that day, you see. My ex-wife and I had a huge argument over my kid, and who should get to see her, so of course I was going to be a bit late. I grabbed a torch and the key, and headed down into the supply closet. It was just behind a couple of brooms that there was an old door, almost painted into the wall. I put the rusty key into the rusty lock, and fiddled with it for a bit until the door finally opened. It was hard to push the door open, considering it hadn't been used in years, but I pushed it open and got to the stairs. They were these mossy concrete slabs basically. I carefully walked down them. I could hear some cracking under my weight, and I don't weigh very much. I finally found myself at the second floor, with a poor, makeshift sign reading records. The second I entered the room, everything felt off. The room went immediately cold, and the smell filled my nose in an instant. Each step I took seemed to echo. I looked around for a bit, surveying the dark abyss that was my surroundings. I finally found the file I was looking for. I can't tell you how glad I was to finally get out of there. I ran to the door that entered the room, except it wouldn't open. I tried to open it. I tried really hard, but it wouldn't budge. The keyhole was gone as well, so I couldn't unlock it. I banged and screamed, but the door wouldn't budge, and nobody would be able to hear me. I heard a rustling noise. I turned around, but there was nothing there. But the feeling of being watched was like having something being burned into the back of my neck. I immediately began to panic. My phone had little to no service, and my puffer was running low, and I panicked very easily. I ran around the room trying to find another way out, desperately looking for some semblance of an exit. Then I heard it. A ding. I turned around and there was a flickering light that I hadn't noticed earlier. It was a really old elevator. I remembered that there was an old boarded up elevator door up in the lobby. Maybe I could get back there and call for help, I thought. I got into the elevator and sure enough, there was a button to go up to the lobby. I pushed the button without a second thought. At first it stayed still for a few seconds, before roaring to life and slowly rising. I watched floor 0 sink beneath my feet as I rose above it. As I looked across the room for the last time, I remember seeing something. A figure moving through the darkness, but it was probably just my shadow drifting upwards. The lobby. It took a while, but the elevator finally got up to the lobby. The elevator screeched to a halt, and the first set of doors opened. The cage doors, however, did not. I went up to see if I could pry it open, but nothing worked. It took me a while, but I noticed something different. The lobby was packed with people. People bustling around all over the place. Our company hadn't been that busy for years. I called out for help, but nobody seemed to hear me. Like they couldn't even see me. I noticed everyone's clothing as well. It seemed a bit dated. Like they had gone to some early 2000s party or something like that. It was then I noticed a family. A man, his wife, and their baby. They stood in the lobby talking to themselves. There was something off about this family. The man, who appeared to be the husband, wore a very tattered and torn suit. He stood there talking to his wife, who looked fairly dirty, before he kissed her, and his child, and turned around. The man was me. I don't know how, but it was me. Me from a few years ago. I realized that I remembered this day. It was the day I applied for the job. I hadn't remembered this day before, like I had blocked it from my memory, but seeing it happen in front of me brought it back. That's when it hit me. On that day, I went into floor 0. I had to get a file that day. I can't remember anything else that had happened. I can't even remember that happening, but I know it did. I watched me approach the elevator before he pushed a button. The cage doors opened and he walked in. He nodded his head at me and began to talk. I was in such a state that I could barely listen, let alone respond. He talked about how he was excited for his life and what was to come. That was all I remember. Floor 1. We reached floor 1, the door slid open, and the younger me stepped out. I recognized this place to be my apartment block. The hallway outside my apartment stretched out before my eyes. Young me tipped his hat to me and walked over to his apartment and knocked on the door. My wife opened the door and I whispered something to her before she pulled him into a tight hug. It was a fond memory. I stepped into the apartment as the elevator went up again. Floor 2. At floor 2 I was in my office. It seemed to be a few years later than floor 1. I could see the date on a calendar. It was an older and, I'll admit, fatter me. I remembered this part well, unfortunately. I had been working for hours and hours. There were bags under my eyes. I looked like death. The phone rang. This is where everything went south for every single version of me that I've seen so far. This day was our daughter's birthday, and I decided not to go because I was too tired. I watched the younger me tell my wife this. I felt disgusted even myself. "Go to her birthday, you idiot!" I screamed at me, but he couldn't hear. The elevator went up again. Floor 3, 4, and 5. I watched myself enter the bar. I walked in. I had to wait for hours. Before I walked out again, completely drunk. I went up again. It was the same situation but a different day. Up again. Same shit, different day. Shame crept all over me like a lion ready to pounce a gazelle. I knew what was next. Floor 6. It was my daughter's birthday. She had just turned 4. I waited for a bit. I was on the floor of the dusty elevator, my head in my hands. I didn't want to watch. I heard drunken me storm into the apartment, my wife screaming, my daughter crying, and me yelling. I know what I did was wrong, and I spend every single day of my life regretting it. I heard my daughter scream. There was a bang. Her arm, you drunk idiot. Your daughter. You monster. The elevator doors closed. All I could hear was my fist connecting my wife's face. Floor 7. I didn't even want to watch anymore. It was the police interrogating me about beating my wife. Even remembering it was bad, but having to watch it was worse. Floor 8. The judge ruled me an unfit parent to my daughter. I could feel the entire weight of everything I'd ever done weighing down on my shoulders. Like all my past selves were sitting on my head. I'd already broken down completely. My eyes stung from the crying. I deserve what I got. Floor 9. It was a pitch black room. From the darkness stepped every past version of myself. They all stepped into the elevator with me. None of them said a word. They all just stared at me, not even breaking eye contact. Floor 10. It was the final version of me. Many years older than myself, curled up in a ball, skinny as a bone, shivering from the cold. Trapped between file cabinets, it was floor 0, and I realized I'd earned it. My hell, my punishment for everything I did, to my family, to my daughter, to myself. Floor 0. The elevator opened and so did the cage doors. I stepped off. I turned to take a last look at my past selves, but they were gone, back to where they belonged. I looked around the empty abyss of floor 0, my resting place. I walked away from the lift. I could hear somebody screaming. I ran towards the sound and there it was. Me once again, banging on the locked-in door. I let out a gasp. He turned around. He looked terrified. I ducked out of view. I watched as he turned and walked towards the elevator, which just let out a ding. He climbed in. I watched him rise up and out of floor 0. The same journey I experienced. He floated above like a Christ figure, and I could have sworn that he saw me. I walked around the room for a bit, until finally, my phone got service. I would have called the police to make my escape, but I chose not to. I decided to write this post. Not to redeem myself, but to explain and to apologize, and to warn. To my loving wife, I cannot express to you just how truly sorry I am. You had always been there for me, even in my darkest hours. And then when you needed me most, I shut you out, and tore our family apart with my bare, drunken hands. To my beautiful daughter, I know you'll probably never see me again and you won't want to, and that's okay. I wouldn't want to either. But I hope you know, wherever you are, that I love you. I know you'll grow into a strong woman, just like your mother. Please never lose your hope. I love you. And to all those reading this that I never met, I want to say, for you all to treasure your life, and to never give up like I did. We've only got one life, don't waste it away. And when you find that one beautiful thing we call family, don't let it go. Hold it close to your heart forever, and always. I'm sorry everything had to turn out this way, but I'm afraid it did. And I'm glad it did. This is what I deserve. Goodbye. What follows is a retelling of events that took place over 3 months ago. I can tell my mind is slipping, and it's hard to type correctly. I've had to rewrite this sentence a few times already, but this story needs to be told, as a warning to any who read it, or find themselves in a similar situation as I did all those months ago. It all started when I left my girlfriend's house on a humid April night. The dark, barren road stretched out before me, seemingly never-ending as the pavement rolled under my car like an endless loop. Trees and fields lined each side of the road, just out of my headlight's reach. The moon was full, shining brightly on the dark earth and illuminating everything in a slight blue shimmer. Honestly, I could probably turn my headlights off and drive perfectly fine once my eyes adjusted to the minimal light. These were the thoughts that roamed my mind every time I left my girlfriend's house. Her parents' house was out in the middle of bumfuck nowhere, and I usually left late into the night so I could spend the most possible time with her. The only real thing to be afraid of out here was a deer and the occasional stray cat, but my mind still connected all sorts of mysterious and horrific things that could be lurking in the darkness. It didn't help that I was listening to a horror story podcast as I drove either. Naturally, I was freaked out, but I did my best to think about the great night I'd had with my girlfriend. It wasn't much. We just cuddled on the couch in her basement, ate mac and cheese, and finally got around to watching Stranger Things. It was such a good show, and watching it with her made it a million times better. We watched the entire first season, start to finish, by the time I left. We were both excited to start season 2 when we next met, but also sad that it would be over a week before then. It's worth mentioning we were both seniors in high school at the time, so school and jobs often made it difficult to find time to spend together, and the time always went by far too quickly when we managed to find some. My train of thought and my car both came to a screeching halt as I slammed on the brakes. When I finally came to a stop, I took a moment to snap back to reality as my focus came back to the present. The thing that had caused me to stop was a dying deer in the middle of the road. I'm not sure how I had seen it, nor how my legs had slammed the brakes purely on instinct. Regardless, the poor thing was barely alive, its chest rising and falling with panicked breaths as its head rolled back to look at my car. It was covered in blood but had no wounds that I could see. Thoughts whizzed through my mind as I tried to understand what was happening. Maybe the animal had been hit by a car, but that didn't seem likely, as there was no other car around or evidence of a crash. Plus the deer was in the dead center of the road, almost like it had been placed there. Unless there was someone out here doing some illegal hunting in the night, there's no other rational explanation to why this deer was here. Flashes of light from the field to my right suddenly pulled my attention away from the animal. Bright beams of light quickly shone through my windows, blinding me. I held my hand to cover my eyes and quickly turned left, but found that there were lights on my left also. Peeking between my fingers, I realized there were many light sources, at least 10 plus on each side of my car, and they were getting closer. Panic set in, and I swiftly pulled my car into reverse. I slammed the gas pedal and flew back away from the deer and lights. When I was about 100 feet away from the scene, another set of headlights appeared out from the trees behind me. For a second, I thought it was a cop and felt relieved. I slowed my car to a stop, and the other car did the same behind me. The relief that had previously washed over my body instantly froze, as I realized the car was not a cop. 6 men piled out of the vehicle, shining more flashlights into my retinas. I shifted into drive and pushed the gas again. My only option now was to try and swerve past the deer and away from the men, so I did just that. With blazing speed, I came upon the deer and men in the field once more. The people tried to swarm my car, but I was too fast. I sped around the deer and quickly left the men behind. They stood in the middle of the road, just behind the deer, and watched me go. Relief once again rolled over me, as the adrenaline began to seep out of my veins. I breathed deeply, trying to calm my aggressively beating heart. I had made it. I had escaped the mysterious men. In my panic, however, I hadn't noticed the podcast had started skipping. I picked up my phone, trying to turn the story off, but it stopped on its own as I lost connection. Looking at the top of the screen, I noticed there were no bars and the words, "No service," shown in bold text next to the empty bars. My first thought was that the people were somehow jamming my phone signal in an attempt to keep me from calling for help, but that's when I noticed the snowflakes accumulating on my windshield. I turned my wipers on, and the thick flakes slid away, revealing a very different world. Despite the fact that it was the middle of April, around 8 inches of snow blanketed the ground, even on the road. My car began to lose traction, so I pressed the brakes and gripped the steering wheel tightly. The car then fishtailed fiercely, and I lost control. My car flew off the road and slammed into a ditch. Thankfully I wore a seatbelt, but that didn't stop the severe whiplash I'd felt when coming to a sudden stop from at least 50 miles per hour. I leaned back in my seat and held my head, which was pounding with pain now. My vision was blurry and doubled, but quickly came back to focus after a few moments. I turned the car off and checked my phone again. Still no service. With little choice, I opened the door and stumbled out of the ditch and onto the road. That's when I realized my nose was bleeding severely. I felt a thick warm liquid flowing freely down my face, the metallic taste infesting my mouth. I spit it out onto the snow and noticed another thing was off. The light of the moon, which had shown a brilliant blue before, was now a crimson color. I looked up to get a good look at it, and sure enough, the celestial object was also shining the shade of red. More blood filled my mouth, so I looked back down to spit it out and began to shiver. It had been a scorching hot summer only 5 minutes ago, so I was wearing just a t-shirt, shorts, and my usual sneakers. With snow up to my ankles, and a strong wind billowing over the open fields I stood between, I quickly began to freeze. Going over my options, I remember that I kept a throw blanket in the backseat of my car, so my girlfriend could wrap herself up in it when she got cold. It didn't get used much outside of winter or fall, but I was always too lazy to take it out of my car. Thankful for my laziness, I went to the vehicle and opened the back door. I felt the soft fabric of the blanket and pulled it out. It wouldn't do much, but it was something. Rustling in the grass on the opposite side of my car made me freeze. I slowly picked my head up and looked out the passenger side window. There, peering through the glass, was something that resembled a person. The being that leaned in and peeked through the window at me looked human, but only without skin. The exposed muscles and tendons almost made me vomit. If my fear hadn't kept it down, I knew the creature was staring at me, despite the fact that its eyes were rolled back into its skull and its expression was blank. As soon as I'd felt its gaze upon me and recognized it, its eyes rolled down into a normal position, and its mouth curled up into a wide, cartoonish smile that stretched up to the base of its ears. Pure joy radiated off the thing, but it was partnered with a malevolence that chilled me to my core. It then continued to stare at me with its petrifying face, before speaking a single word.
Hi.
Its voice was deep and demonic, but also with a slight echo effect, almost like two voices speaking at once. Before I could react, the thing had crawled onto the roof of my car. Without thinking, I jumped into the back seat and pulled the door closed behind me with my foot. The automatic lock clicked into place as the creature's head slowly slid into view from the top of the window frame, its facial expression not changing in the slightest. It repeated the greeting and slowly winded a fist up, bringing it down quickly onto the window, shattering it. I screamed as the glass flew into the car, and a wet hand gripped my left ankle tightly. I kicked my leg ferociously, but the steel grip on my leg didn't loosen in the slightest. After a moment, I suddenly felt a shooting pain come from my left hip, and weightlessness as I flew through the air. I landed hard on snow-covered pavement, causing all the air in my lungs to come out in a wheeze. I got myself to my hands and knees and heaved heavily. My limbs began to go numb, which subdued the piercing pain that shot up from my left leg. I guessed it was dislocated based on what the creature had done to me. I looked over my shoulder back at my car and saw the monstrosity on the roof. It was in an unnatural spider-like position, its limbs jutting straight out from its body and bent perfectly 90 degrees at the joints. It still stared at me, its facial expression not changing.
Run.
It said. Not needing to be told twice, I got to my feet. My left leg protested numbly, but my adrenaline-fueled panic kept me going. I sprinted as quickly as I could despite my injury back toward where I had escaped the mysterious men before. I don't know how far I had gone since then, but I thought that if I could get to them, they could help me. I was about 50 yards away from my wrecked car, when I heard the creature screech a blood-curdling scream. I looked over my shoulder to see the monster leap off the car and begin scuttling towards me at an ungodly speed. Its eyes had rolled back into its skull, and its head lolled wildly as a burst of hysterical laughter came from it. My fear pushed me harder as I broke into a full-on sprint, ignoring the protests from my leg. I screamed and ran as I heard the monster getting closer and closer with each passing second. My mind raced and my legs pumped harder than they ever had, but it wasn't enough. The creature tackled me into the snow and continued to laugh hysterically. I tried to roll onto my back, but it held me down onto my stomach. I continued to scream until all the air had left my lungs. My yells for help slowly turned into a whisper as my throat burned and my vocal cords felt like they'd torn. Once I stopped screaming, the creature stopped laughing. I turned my head to look up at it, only to see it staring down on me.
Wake.
It said, before hitting me hard in the face. When I came to, I was laying in my bed at my house. My alarm was blaring for me to wake up, so I turned it off. I moved my left leg slowly and found that there was no pain whatsoever. I then moved to my bathroom carefully and found no other wounds on my body or face. I sat on my toilet and put my head in my hands to think about what had happened, and at the time, I thought it was all just a terrible dream I'd had after getting home the night before. That was 3 months ago, and for those few months, I've lived my life as normally as ever. I'd forgotten about the dream after a while, but now I know that it wasn't just a dream. For the last week, I felt unbelievably sick. with a fever in the hundreds for days straight. My girlfriend went on vacation with her family about 2 days ago, and I'm thankful she's not here, because when I woke up this morning and went to brush my teeth, I noticed a large piece of skin missing from just below my left eye. The exposed muscles and tendons not hurting in the slightest. But since then my skin has felt heavy and wet, like I'm just swimming in a full sweatsuit. I've begun to scratch it off fiercely, peeling it off in chunks, and I can feel my mind slipping farther as I finish typing this. The skin on my fingertips is flaking off in bloody globs all over my keyboard. I don't know if I'll be able to escape my town before I fully turn, but I'm going to try as soon as this is posted. Wish me luck. The closet has never been open in my lifetime, the one at the end of the hallway. It was bolted shut, wooden planks hazardly nailed to the edges, the aforementioned nails covered in rust and grime, the bottom gap covered and stuffed with multiple towels, many of which were thick, dense enough to keep whatever was inside from escaping. It was a white door, a simple one, from what I could tell. No scratches, no marks, only a chip near the handle. My parents urged me to never go to that end of the manor. They had all belongings transferred over to other wings, but only that one remained barren and cold. It was always cold there. We inherited our manor when my great-grandmother died. I never really liked her. She always had an insane, dead look in her eyes. She would never speak, never come to visit, never move. Last I saw of her, she resided in the West Wing, in an old, creaky room with terrible black wallpaper. My parents never let me go near the East Wing, especially my mother. My father defended me when I got too close, but after a talk with my mother, he got tight-lipped. I remember as a child asking why we weren't allowed to go into the East Wing when we visited my great-grandmother. I remember her saying the closet held a secret staircase, and that if you follow that staircase, there's a room. In that room lies a frozen block of ice. If you get too close, you'll freeze to death. At the time, it seemed like a scary children's story, but I was too scared to even think of going down there. It had been years before I was ready to confront it. I escaped from my bed, my phone's flashlight on, as I made my way into the East Wing. The maternal side of my family always had a really high body temperature. It sounds rather odd to say, but we always were so warm. It sometimes felt like we were burning. In the summertime, it was the worst, and the winter was a blazing in disguise for us. However, when I walked near the East Wing, all of that warmth seemed to drain, slowly, gradually. It wasn't like I was shivering or getting goosebumps. It felt like I was thread on a bobbin, and someone was pulling the thread away from me. There was something that felt very peculiar, and for my sanity, I couldn't put my finger on it. The door got closer. I grew colder. It seemed almost as if it were moving to me on its own, but I knew that it had to be nonsense. Finally, I was in front of the door, my metal phone case nearly frostbitingly cold. The nails of the door were not that difficult to pry off. The wooden bars had long since molded and rotted. It was difficult to do so silently, however, and I knew that there was a high chance that my parents would wake up to the noise, even if they were on the other side of the manor. I unrolled the towels at the bottom of the door. The moldy, crusty towels disguised me rightfully so. There were many stuck down there, whatever that room is. There probably was no light. I pulled out 8 of them. What were my parents trying to hide? There was a small latch on the door, an insignificant latch. I opened it and immeasurably pulled my hand away, as I felt the most biting feeling I've ever felt in my life. The metal was freezing. Now that I looked at it, it was frosted over. I took one of the towels to the handle of the doorknob and twisted it open, the cold pricking me even from the covered surface. Slowly I opened the door, and cringed as it made the most loud creak as I did so. The stairs were front and center, the wooden steps leading only downwards, not up. It was smaller than I imagined, and I had to duck as I entered. Surprisingly, the steps were in good shape, no rotting, no creaking. It almost concerned me. Why? If this place hadn't been opened in possibly centuries, had these stairs remained unscathed? The cold distracted me from completing the thought. It was positively freezing here, my hands shaking as I gripped my phone. I left the door open, as there was no inner door handle, and I wasn't stupid. As I'm going down the stairs, however, I did prove myself wrong and made a stupid decision. I tried to remove my phone's metal casing as it was stinging my hands, but dropped it in the process. I stared as the phone tumbled down the stairs until it slid at the bottom, the flashlight flickering, then shutting off. Without the phone, everything seemed dark. I wanted to discontinue, go back upstairs, close the door and tell my parents, but I saw a blue light at the end of the staircase. It was so faint. It seemed to be coming from a room far away from it. I made my way down the steps, holding the railing as I went, my breath becoming quicker, my hands shaky. I was feeling drained, like I lost everything, and I followed the light like it was the only thing that could help. I traveled all the way down, step by step by step, circling the blue light. It was my only focus. I finally stopped as I realized there were no more steps to climb down. I looked around and realized that I was at the end of a hallway with black wallpaper. At the end of this hallway was a faint blue light. It was closer now. I picked up my phone and headed towards the light. I walked at first, but it seemed so far away. I started to speed walk, then jog, and eventually run. It was getting closer minute by minute, until I finally reached it. It was a small gray room, with gray carpet which felt stiff under my feet, and stark gray wallpaper, with no designs except what looked like old, thin, unrecognizable script drawn into it. The blue light? It was a single light bulb with a sky blue hue emitting from it. Close up, it burned so dimly, slightly flickering. While looking at it, I noticed my breath fog in front of me. I looked down at my hands. I couldn't feel them anymore. I couldn't feel much of myself in general. It stung to blink, my tears turning to ice as they came out. No, I didn't want this. I had to get out of there immediately. I heard a loud thud and frantic footsteps going up the stairs. They were quick, loud, the thump of each step reaching my ears as it climbed higher and higher and higher. Finally, the door shuts with a singular thud and the faint sound of a lock. I couldn't believe it. I stared at the endless showdown hallway in disbelief slowly, painstakingly. I turned to the light bulb. Right next to it was broken cobbles of ice.